Now, we will present a general introduction of today's lecturer's background.
Good evening to everyone in the Western Hemisphere and good morning to everyone in the Eastern Hemisphere. We are delighted to welcome you again to our distinguished lectures at Escuela Nacional Preparatoria 3, Justo Sierra of the UNAM, 2020-2021, The Meaning of Meanings. Today's lecturer is Professor Daniel Casasanto from the Cornell University. The work of Professor Daniel Casasanto is a huge bridge between the world of cognitive neuroscience and the world of linguistic research. Professor Casasanto is a true pioneer in every sense of the word. Cognitive neuroscience is actually a very young field of research. For instance, functional magnetic resonance imaging was devised only some 30 years ago. This is not to say that cognitive neuroscience is 30 years old, since there were other brain imaging machines and techniques way before MRI. But this does give an idea of how much this field has been rapidly evolving. Professor Casasanto has employed not only fMRI to carry out his research, but also steady-state visual evoked potential, electroencephalography, transcranial direct current stimulation, eye tracking, and other brain imaging techniques to explore the nature of cognitive neural representations of numbers, space-time, motor actions, word learning, manual action verbs, sign language, abstract concepts such as good and bad, linguistic relativity, embodied cognition, and adult cognition, amongst many other topics of research.
Professor Daniel Casasanto received his PhD in Brain and Cognitive Sciences from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He is a graduate student in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania. He holds a GPD in vocal performance from the Peabody Conservatory of Music from the Johns Hopkins University. He studied a BA in English literature at Oberlin College, and he completed a BA in vocal performance at the Oberlin Conservatory of Music. Professor Daniel Casasanto has authored and co-authored more than 100 scientific papers, has received 11 national and international awards, has won 16 national and international grants, has worked in 11 editorial boards and services, has peer reviewed about 80 conference papers, has presented more than 50 conference posters, has given almost 200 as a plenary talk, 200 talks as a plenary, keynote or invited speaker in all sorts of scientific conferences, has acted as a reviewer in more than 60 scientific journals, and has published almost 130 press articles and commentaries.
We cannot hear you.
Sergio, tu micrófono.
Yeah, sorry. We could easily continue perusing through the rest of Professor Daniel Casasanto's endless CV for 5 or 10 more minutes. But we would like to make the most out of his time in today's presentation. So, without any further ado, we welcome Professor Daniel Casasanto to our series of distinguished lectures. Welcome, Professor Daniel Casasanto.
Thank you, Professor Padilla. I really appreciate it. And thank you all. Thank you for that very kind introduction. And thank you. It's an honor to be with you, at least digitally. I'm very grateful for the invitation. I really wish that I were with you more than just digitally. As I was mentioning a moment ago, the wind is howling outside and we're in the middle of a snowstorm in Ithaca, upstate New York. If I disappear suddenly, I have to mention that the electric company has warned that the power could go out at any time because of this wind and the damage it's causing. So if I leave the party, you'll have to please excuse me. We'll come up with a plan B. But I hope that won't happen. We wouldn't be worrying about this at all if things were a little different in the world today and I could travel to Mexico. I imagine it's less snowy there. But in case the power goes out, I'll try to talk fast before that happens. Thank you again. What I'd like to talk with you about today is the proposal that every time we use a concept or understand the meaning of a word, we're creating that meaning ad hoc for the circumstances. And the idea motivating this proposal is that we as cognitive scientists have created some of our own hardest problems that cannot be solved, but they don't need to be. Instead, they can be dissolved and reframed in light of two assumptions that I want to argue for. The first assumption is that the scientific constructs that we think about all the time and write about all the time, constructs like concepts and like lexical entries, these are made up. They're human inventions created by scholars for other scholars and can therefore be used or changed or discarded as we see fit. Now, this suggestion is not meant to devalue these constructs. Rather, it's to free us from the fealty we might feel toward them if we think that what we're studying are not constructs made up by other scientists, but are in fact natural kinds. Instead, I think these constructs are tools that our community has fashioned and that we can refashion as needed to help us understand things that we're trying to understand, things like language and brain and mind. The second assumption is that our brains and minds are continually shaped by the contexts in which we're doing our thinking. Now, this dynamism of our minds is a little bit hard to intuit sometimes, but so is the dynamism of the natural world more broadly. Things may feel much more static than they really are. We feel, for example, that the ground we're standing on, or in my case, sitting on, is pretty stable, right? It's hard to wrap our heads around the fact that, in fact, the earth beneath us is spinning around and hurtling through space. But the fact that that dynamism is hard to intuit doesn't mean it's not there. So with these assumptions as a backdrop, let's turn to one of the big questions that animates the cognitive sciences. What's in our minds? What are our thoughts made of? For a long time, this question could only be addressed through metaphor and through allegory. Plato, for example, worked his way through a bunch of metaphors, at one point positing that maybe the mind is like a bird cage, an aviary, and each piece of knowledge in that bird cage, each piece of knowledge is a bird. When we're not using a piece of knowledge, it's free to flap about the cages of our memories, right? When we need to use a concept, a piece of knowledge, a word meaning, all we have to do is retrieve, right? That is to catch the right bird. Now, there's a hidden assumption here, and that is that knowledge is divided up the way that birds are divided up into individual birds, right? The assumption is that knowledge is itemized and pre-packaged into units that exist in our memories, fully formed, waiting for us to retrieve them, birds that are waiting to be caught. Well, Plato moved on from this metaphor for reasons that he explained to us, moreover, it was clear back in Plato's time, as it is now, that there are not actually birds in our head. But now we posit that our minds are populated by even more elusive creatures that we call concepts and categories and word meanings. Although we sometimes talk about these constructs separately, they're usually very hard to separate. According to standard definitions, concepts are bodies of knowledge that allow us to categorize, and categories are the extensions of concepts, and words have meanings by activating concepts or labeling categories. So they're all interconnected. So for convenience, we can collapse these three constructs into one, and I'll refer to concepts, categories, and word meanings for most of our talk together as CCNMs, just for simplicity. I want to suggest that our current theories of CCNMs preserve one key element of the aviary model of the mind, the bird-catching model of the mind, to the detriment of cognitive science. And that is that we have this unshakable intuition as people and as scientists that CCNMs exist in some sense, fully formed, even when we're not using them, waiting for us to access them, like looking up entries in a mental encyclopedia or a mental dictionary. Well, here's an alternative. Maybe all CCNMs are created ad hoc. So let me flesh this out a little bit. According to the ad hoc cognition proposal that Gary Lupian and I made a few years ago, a concept, category, or word meaning, one of these CCNMs, is a dynamic pattern of information that is made active transiently as needed in response to internally generated or external cues. So under this view, the meaning of the word cat is the pattern of neural and cognitive activity that results from processing this cue, that is the word form, in a given physical, social, linguistic, mnemonic, and physiological context, all of these various aspects of the context that affect how we process the cues we encounter. This pattern of activity that constitutes the meaning of the word cat will never be the same twice, and it will vary on at least 3 different overlapping timescales, from 1 millisecond to the next, according to what we can call activation dynamics of activity spreading throughout our brains and changing our minds. On a slightly longer timescale that we can refer to as the local context, the experimental context or the conversational context that you're in. And on the longest timescale, these CCNMs vary systematically from one individual to the next or one group to the next, according to people's experiential histories. This is what I call experiential relativity. The CCNMs that we form vary relative to the kinds of experiences that we have. So let's contrast this ad hoc meaning construction process with what I take to be a generic standard view of how words have meanings. So on this view, we can take this off the shelf from Jackendoff or any leading theorist of how words have meanings. Here's how it goes, a rough boxology. We have a word, right? And it doesn't have to be a word, but we're going to stick with word forms for the moment. It could be a picture, it could be a gesture, a symbol that has a conventional meaning. And when let's say we hear the word cat, we first form we activate an internal representation of that word's form. We recognize it as an instance, that pattern of sound, we recognize to be an instance of the word form cat. That word form cat, once we've identified it, serves as an internal cue to activate the concept that corresponds to that word form. Having identified the word form cat, we go and retrieve our cat concept, right? And that's really the heart of this, or our cat mental dictionary entry, our cat semantics. And that's really the heart of this theory, that we classify the word form and use it as an internal cue to activate a concept or a stored word meaning. Then optionally, we might also activate some information that is associated with that concept in our memories. So how does this standard view differ from the ad hoc view? Well, on the ad hoc view, of course, we still start with word forms, but we are always encountering those word forms in a context, in a physical, social, linguistic, mnemonic, physiological, etc. context. And the next phase is also very, very much the same between these two views. We need to, when we get the sound cat flying through the air, we need to hear it and identify it as an instance of the word form cat. But then things get different. On the ad hoc view, there is no box that has the concept or the semantics of cat in it. Instead, having identified the word form cat, that word form serves as an internal cue to activate information that is contextually relevant given this cue in this context. And whatever that network of information that we activate is, that constitutes the meaning of the word cat in this instance, in this context. So the idea here is that it's an illusion that word forms simply map onto a concept. And this illusion is encouraged by lots of factors. And we'll discuss some of those. It is both an illusion. Part of the illusion is that it's a lie that's mixed with the truth, right? One of the factors that leads us to believe that there is this mapping, this stored mapping, is that often a given word form tends to occur in a fairly constrained set of contexts. To the extent that the context is similar across time, that you encounter this given word form in similar contexts across time, the network of information that gets activated will be pretty similar. And this similarity of the context in which you encounter a word's form yields some true stability. But what I want to suggest is that true stability, even though it's there, it's emergent. It's not built into the process, and it's not guaranteed, and it might disappear when that same word form is used in a new context. So one entailment of this ad hoc meaning construction process is that, in principle, any word form can cue any network of information in memory, given the right context. That is to say, in principle, if we accept that the meaning of a word is the pattern of neurocognitive activity that it causes, then any word can mean anything. It's just that some meanings are more likely than others. Now, this may sound crazy, but I actually think that it's true, and that it is crucial for us to understand if we want to advance theories of mind and of language. So, obviously, not everybody agrees with this crazy claim, especially not at first. So, what do people say? Well, a wise friend once pointed out to me that there are really only three kinds of answers that we academics give to each other when we're confronted with new ideas. The first answer is, that's crazy and that can't possibly be true. What were you thinking? The second answer is, oh, yes, of course, what you're saying is true, but it's trivially so. Everybody believes that already. And the third answer is, OMG, that's true. And it's really important. And in fact, I said the same thing in my dissertation. So the amazing thing about trying to talk about this proposal with our colleagues is that I get all three of these responses, sometimes from the same person. So let me try to articulate this view a little bit more, and you can decide which of these answers you prefer. So here's our plan for the next half hour or so. First, we're going to talk about, well, how is what you're suggesting different from you fill in the name of the previous researcher? Second, I want to move on to why is it so hard, if everything is ad hoc, why is it so hard to intuit that this is the case? And third, how might ad hoc cognition, this framework, change the way we think about thinking and language use? So we'll see what we get through. If we run out of time, or if the power goes out, then we'll adjust the plan. So how is this idea different from you fill in the name? Well, in some ways, it's not different from lots of things that have been said previously. There are lots of parents to this idea. The idea that the stability of the natural world is an illusion dates back thousands of years. Presumably, this is what Heraclitus meant when he said that it is not possible to step twice into the same river. Why? Because rivers are always changing. You may be able to experience, quote, the same river for some purposes at some levels of description, but for others, it's most definitely not the same. And the ways that it differs could really matter. Maybe the same river was pure at time 1, but it's poisoned at time 2. This idea has another parent closer to home. William James talks a lot about the stream of thought and about how no idea is ever the same twice. At one point, he writes, a permanently existing idea, which makes its appearance before the footlights of consciousness at periodic intervals, is a mythological entity. Half a century later, Wittgenstein tells us in this famous argument that CCNMs, or at least word meanings, have no necessary or core features, even though it's really hard to shake the intuition that they do. If you recall this passage, consider what we mean, what we call games: board games, card games, ball games, Olympic games, and so on. what is common to all of them. Don't just say there must be something common or we would not call them all games, but look and see. For if you look at them, you will not see something in common at all. Okay, so since antiquity, up through some of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century, people have raised the possibility that the stability of the world and the stability of the mind is an illusion. So these days, does anybody really believe that there are fixed CCNMs or that there are context invariant cores to our concepts and word meanings? Maybe this is a straw man, right? But actually, it's not a straw man. This is exactly what lots of people believe. So I want to illustrate that. One silly illustration, the chapter that Professor Padilla was kind enough to circulate is from a book called The Conceptual Mind. It's a bunch of people's manifestos about concepts. They were kind enough to include mine, which is called All Concepts Are Ad Hoc Concepts. Now this chapter is trapped for eternity in one tiny section of this book, one little ghetto of this book that is dedicated to contextual variability of concepts. And this little ghetto only has 2 chapters in it. Ours is saying that all concepts are constructed ad hoc. The other is saying that all concepts are accessed in a context-independent manner. So these are the 2 views on context dependence. It's all it's all context dependent, or it's never context dependent. So these poor chapters will be slugging it out. Every time I close the cover of this book, I feel sorry for them trapped in there. But actually, it's an interesting debate to have, and I want to continue having it together tonight. So let's go to researchers who you might associate with the idea that at least some of our thinking is ad hoc. People who have championed the idea of ad hoc thinking and brought this term to our attention in the field of cognitive psychology. So one of these theorists is Larry Barsalou, who in a landmark paper in 1983 introduced this idea of ad hoc categories to the field. Barsalou posited that there's a categorical difference between what he called common categories, like furniture, that we use most of the time, and special purpose ad hoc categories, like things to sell at a garage sale, that we can optionally construct in special cases when there's no real category available. Well, Barsalou told us that the categories on the right are the ones that are constructed ad hoc, but that the ones on the left are not constructed ad hoc. They are memorized and just retrieved when you need them. Well, let's agree that there is certainly a difference in how frequently we might need a category from one of these lists versus the other. Hopefully you need to think about food more often than you need to think about ways to escape from the mafia. But what I want to suggest is that none of these categories is simply memorized and then retrieved from memory. They're always being constructed. How can we see that process? Well, if we look at these example categories, we see that people use these common categories, like furniture and pets and food, in ad hoc ways all the time. The extension of the category furniture depends critically on what you're furnishing. If you're furnishing a kitchen, for example, then even prototypical pieces of furniture, like a couch or a bed, have no place in your furniture category. If you're furnishing a campsite, right, then a fallen tree can become furniture. Pets, sure, cats and dogs and fish might be the most common pets, but people will keep anything as pets, right? From pet llamas to pet rocks. What counts as food varies hugely between individuals and groups, right? According to my 1-year-old daughter, the category of food, of things that you put in your mouth and try to eat, includes pretty much everything. So these common categories are probably being constructed ad hoc, and if they weren't, they wouldn't do very much work for us. They wouldn't do very much good. So moving from moving from categories to concepts, another one of our CCNMs, some researchers posit a similar distinction to Barsalou's ad hoc versus conventional categories in the realm of concepts. Some theorists, a la Contextual, illustrated what they think of as the difference between real concepts and ad hoc concepts with this example. If you say that Eric Clapton is a great guitarist, that's using a conventional memorized concept. But if you say Eric Clapton is God to mean that he's a great guitarist, that's using an ad hoc concept. They suggest first that these ad hoc concepts play a complementary role to real concepts. But then they go on, to me somewhat confusingly, and suggest that surprisingly, ad hoc concepts turn out not to be concepts at all. So there's not a lot of discussion of ad hoc concepts in the literature, but even researchers who are giving some real attention to this idea are suggesting that ad hoc concepts are different from real, regular concepts and secondary to them, and then perhaps that they don't exist at all. So that's hardly a ringing endorsement of the existence and importance of ad hoc concepts. I want to suggest instead that all concepts are constructed ad hoc, and that the activation of information in memory is guided by cues like these words that we see in the context of our background knowledge about their conventional reference. So we can see how even a common idea like Eric, like being a great guitarist is going to be massively context dependent, right? Saying Eric Clapton is a great guitarist, by saying Eric Clapton is a great guitarist, you mean something quite different from Manuel Barrueco as a great guitarist, right? Different music, different guitar, different kinds of greatness, different audiences. If you tried to substitute one of these notions of great guitarist for the other, you would be hilariously mistaken, right? So let's move on to word meanings. Finally, let's turn to our third CCNM. Again, even researchers who have shown real interest in effects of context on word meaning have held firm to this idea that Macheri was telling us about in that chapter title, the idea that words have core meanings. And Larry Barcelou, exploring this idea about the same time that he proposed ad hoc categories, concluded that although context does affect word meaning somewhat, context-independent properties form the core meanings of words. There are cores to word meaning that are activated, as he wrote, maximally and obligatorily whenever we use these words. Well, Wittgenstein challenged us to find these obligatory features of meaning, challenged us to look for them and see if they're really there, and showed that if we really look, they can't be found. Moreover, even if they could, core features that contribute to the conventional meanings of words can't explain how people actually use words to make meaning, in light of something that the psychologist Herbert Clark called the ubiquity of nonsense. So ubiquity, of course, means that it's always there. Nonsense means sense, meaning that is just for the nonce, for a special occasion. So Herb pointed out that people use language in ways that are just off the map all the time. And he came up with some silly examples of these ad hoc for the nonce meanings that exist only for the present purposes. And one of these examples, he has this fictitious friend who has a perverse habit of sneaking up behind people and rubbing a teapot on the back of their legs. And this is a habit that his friends call teapotting. Well, once you know this, it's no problem to understand an otherwise nonsensical sentence like Herb's friend got in big trouble because he tried to teapot a policeman. Okay, so clearly a for the nonce meaning. But on a skeptical interpretation of this scenario, of this illustration that Clark created, sure, this use of teapot is definitely novel and could not just be retrieved from the mental lexicon. But semantically, the apple has not fallen very far from the tree, right? This example, where teapotting is kind of close to the conventional meaning of teapot, and in fact involves a conventional teapot, might be in line with what the psychologist Jeff Ellman has expressed about words, although they do not have a finite list of meanings or senses. According to Ellman, every meaning of a word inhabits a bounded region of state space that is inhabited only by other members of this lexeme. So although there's no finite list of meanings or senses, the space of possibilities is bounded, right? And this space is segregated from the space of all other lexemes. Well, if this were true, then the link between words and their meanings, word forms and their meanings would be flexible, but it would also be highly, highly constrained. And an example like teapotting could never be used to support a radical claim like the one that I'm making, which is that given the right context, any word can mean anything. And understanding this is critical to understanding the process of meaning generation. I think this is true, and I think that life provides lots of examples. And I want to give one from my own life. Now, this is an anecdote that stuck with me, probably because there's a tea-related theme. And I think it illustrates that we're not dealing with bounded spaces for each lexeme, that the creation of nonsense is in fact unbounded. Now, I want to warn you that there is some mild adult content that is about to follow. Anybody who wants to can feel free to hit the mute button for the next 3 slides. I'll tell you when you can turn your sound back on. So here's the story. When I was a postdoc, I lived in an apartment complex that was full of young single people, and couples were always forming and breaking apart. It was like a real life telenovela. And one time a new couple had just gotten together, and they arrived at a dinner party late and breathless and disheveled, and their faces were glowing. And the one member of the couple excused them, saying, "Oh, sorry, we're late. We were at my apartment having tea." No, exactly. Thank you. So of course we all knew instantly what tea meant. And somebody said something like, "Oh, is that what they're calling it these days? Ha ha ha." And from then on, in this group of friends, we could use the word tea to mean sex, and everyone understood it. But we also understood it instantly, given that context. How did we do it? How did we know instantly that the lexeme tea was being used in this context to mean sex? Well, let's explore some ways that we definitely didn't do it. The first way is the traditional view of how words have meanings. Again, you can take this off the shelf from Ray Jackendorf or any other traditional view of the mental lexicon, according to which word meanings are stored in a mental lexicon. What does that mean? Well, the lexicon is a catalog of conventional form meaning pairings in long-term memory. But wait, is tea paired with sex in your mental lexicon? I mean, it might be now, but it certainly wasn't paired with sex in my mental lexicon before this event. Okay, so traditional views of the mental lexicon don't explain how we could do this. Let's go to a Jeff Elman-like view of the mental lexicon. Maybe there's no form meaning pairing. Maybe the form indexes a probability density, or as Elman would say, a region of semantic space, that a bounded region of semantic space that constrains what T can and cannot mean. Does that solve our problem? Well, no, I don't think so. Is sex really in that bounded region of space that includes all and only meanings of T? How big is that region, right? And if T inhabits a space, if the space that describes the potential meanings of T is big enough to include sex, what good does that bounded region do for you? What inferential work does it do? I would suggest not much. So Herb Clark's point in 1983, and my point here, is that instances of making nonsense are not the exceptions. So we can't just bracket them and set them aside while we develop theories of, quote, normal language use. This is normal language use, and our theories need to explain it. So the theory that I am suggesting explains it is that we are constructing these meanings ad hoc every time. Just some meanings are more likely than others. So, okay, ad hoc meaning construction is the rule, not the exception. That's the platform. Let's move on to, okay, if you're willing to entertain that maybe this is true, why is it so hard to intuit that it's true? Why does this feel so awkward to us? I think there are lots of reasons. I want to run through a few just to sort of build intuition about why it's so hard to build this intuition. The first, Gary Lupian and I have called the words for concepts illusion. So here's the idea. Word forms are pretty similar every time you encounter them. If they're spoken, they're not exactly the same. If they're printed, they can be exactly the same over and over and over, as here. The word form dog is exactly the same every time we see it on this screen. We have the belief that word forms label concepts. Well, it's natural to assume that if a verbal label is the same time after time, that the concept that is being labeled is also the same time after time. But I want to suggest that's an assumption that is natural to make, but almost certainly false, right? That's the word for concepts illusion. The stability of word forms tricks us into thinking that there is a stability in word meanings that's not really there. So somewhat related, what we've called conceptual change blindness, another reason why it's hard to intuit that all CCNMs are ad hoc. So findings from the study of visual cognition have given rise to two constructs, change blindness and inattentional blindness, that are similar. And both of these show us that to a surprising degree, we only see things that we're paying attention to, and that there can be changes between one visual scene and the next that are right in front of our eyes, sometimes pretty dramatic changes. And if we're not paying attention to them, we just don't notice that the first picture is different from the second picture. Well, that's with concrete visual perception. It's with looking at what's right in the front of our face and not seeing it. Conceptual change blindness is about failing to notice differences in something much more subtle and fleeting and implicit, and that is the thoughts that go on in the privacy of our head. How often do we bother to introspect on the meaning of the word dog ever? Well, let's suppose we do. We're probably not very good at noticing that the meaning of dog at time one, say 2 days ago when I used that word, is different from the meaning of the same word used at time two, right? That we are blind to the changes in our own conception of these concepts or word meanings. So moving on, we can really go through quite a few of these. I'll pick some of my favorites that I think are at the top of the list of why we can't intuit the ad hoc nature of concepts and word meanings. We can call this the reification assumption. So throughout the history of science, there have been lots of constructs, lots of made up ideas that scientists make up to communicate about the natural world with each other. And they end up being discarded sometimes. And one of those is phlogiston. Phlogiston was the hypothetical stuff that supports fire, right? So what is fire? I still find fire mysterious. What is this stuff that is fire, or that supports fire or gives rise to fire? How does this stuff give rise to fire? Right? That was a serious scientific question before we understood about oxidation, right? Now we understand that not only is there no phlogiston, there is no stuff, period. Fire is not a thing. Burning is a process. But we're so tempted, and the fact that we talk in nouns so much in many of our languages, like Spanish, like English, pushes us toward this reification, where we want to be studying, we want to be talking about, and as scientists, we want to be studying stuff, right? Well, sometimes there is no stuff. It's just a process. And thinking about and asking what is this stuff is going to lead us astray. Well, we've done the same thing with concepts as we did with phlogiston. Concepts are these things that we posit. They're these abstract entities, abstract objects. They are the things that support thought, that participate in our syntactic thinking and language processes, right? Then we have to ask, once we've reified concepts, we have to ask, well, what are these things? And how do these things give rise to thoughts? Wait a minute, there are no things. Concepts are a shorthand that are sometimes helpful for us to talk to each other in normal life and in science. But actually, thinking is a process, right? Thinking is best described as conceptualizing. if we look for the concepts, if we reify the process of conceptualizing and insist that there are these objects that we call concepts, we are likely to be wrong in the same way that phlogiston theorists were wrong about the nature of fire. Okay, last one, and then we'll move on to the final module of the talk. I call this the linearity assumption. So let's see, here the gears in our head are neural and cognitive processes, right? Those that give rise to our thoughts and behaviors. So we can all agree that we have experiences, and these experiences get processed in our brains and minds and give rise to our thoughts and behaviors, and our experiences shape those thoughts and behaviors. Well, what's the function that relates experience to thoughts and behaviors? Well, I don't know what that function is, but let's make a simplifying assumption and say that function is the same for everybody, that there is a universal mental machinery that transforms experience into thoughts. Okay, you don't have to believe that, but let's take that as our simplifying assumption. I think that it is common to believe that experience differs from one person to the next and one group to the next, but experience doesn't differ that much. So when you feed experiences that are pretty similar across people and across groups into a universal function, what you get out of pretty similar experiences fed through a universal function is pretty similar thoughts and behaviors that we all think pretty much alike. Well, there's a serious problem with the story that I just told and with this assumption, and that is we don't know what this function is that transforms experience into thought. But I am quite certain that it is not a linear function, right? Whatever that function is, or set of functions might be that transform experience into thinking and behaving, it is certain to be a nonlinear function, right? If only it were linear, the mind would be a lot easier to figure out. It's going to be that function is going to be a nonlinear dynamical function. Well, what do we know about feeding inputs into nonlinear dynamical equations, into nonlinear dynamical functions? What we know is that they have this property. These systems have a property known as sensitive dependence on initial conditions. And what that means is that small differences in the input can cause radically different outputs. That even if it's true that experiences are pretty similar across individuals and only differ a little bit, and even if it were true that there's a universal function that transforms experience into thinking, the thoughts that are produced on the basis of pretty similar experiences filtered through a nonlinear dynamical function might be radically different from each other. And in our third module, I want to give you some illustrations of how that might be the case. So the third module is this. Let's raise the question, how might an ad hoc cognition framework change the way we think about thinking and language use? And the test bed, the model system that I want to draw upon is thinking about time. So why is time such a useful test bed? Well, here's one reason. Time is, for the most part, universal and constant, right? And this makes time unlike lots of other things that people experience. There are century-old debates about whether people from different cultures think differently, and these debates founder on facts like the question, for example, do some people in Africa see colors differently than people in Europe or in the US? Well, if they do, it might be because the light is different and the landscape is different, right? They might be different colors. So of course they see colors differently, right? If we conceptualize, if your idea of a given plant is different from my idea, it might be because the places we live, those plants are actually different, right? They have different form, they have different uses, etc. But time is not going to differ from one place to the next. Sometimes people point out that it differs a little bit if you live in a high rise. Let's bracket that for a moment. That's true. But here on the ground floor, if temporal cognition varies between individuals and groups, and if it's changeable, then we can be pretty darn sure that those changes are not due to changes in time per se. They're due to changes in how we think about time as a function of the context in which we are thinking about it. So choosing time as a test bed, something that is constant and universal, allows us to isolate changes that are due to the context. So what do we know about time? Well, the way people talk about time gives us some great clues. So in English, and as in Spanish and many, many other languages, we talk about time as if it flows along a spatial continuum, a very particular spatial continuum, the front-back continuum. Doctors call this the sagittal axis. And on this axis, the future is ahead of us and the past is behind us, right? We say things like we're looking ahead to the future or looking back to the past. This is true across many languages. Why? Well, here's an idea. The same person who introduced this idea of nonsense was one of the first people to think about, why do we talk about time the way that we do? And let's follow a line of thinking here. The idea is that we talk about time a certain way because we think about it that way. And we think about it that way because of our habitual physical interactions with the world around us and the particular pattern of interactions that we have given the kinds of bodies that we have. So Herb Clark pointed out that our bodies are very much asymmetrical front to back, right? The front side is the business side of our bodies. It's quite different from our back sides. And it's where our limbs are oriented, our hands and feet. It's where our sensory organs are all oriented forward. And as a result, when we travel through the world, when we travel along a spatial path, we travel forward most of the time. We don't tend to travel backwards or sideways like a crab. And then we do this when we're walking. We do this when we get into our vehicles that also have their business side oriented forward, like bicycles and cars. And as we travel forward along spatial paths, there is an inevitable correlation between our experience of space and our experience of time. It is an immutable fact as you travel forward along a spatial path that the things that you will come to in the future, the objects and events that you will come to in the future, lie literally ahead of you in space. The objects and events that you have already encountered in the past lie literally behind you. So our experience of traveling through the world with the kinds of bodies that we have gives rise and it causes us to experience this correlation between time and space that gives rise to the way we think about time, using this spatial metaphor in our minds, and thinking about it that way bubbles up into these linguistic conventions like the ones I just mentioned. That's a pretty cool story, right? And it was so firmly believed for so long that people didn't really consider many alternatives. One thing that cognitive linguists have noted is that English speakers talk about the future is ahead and the past is behind. Earlier times are one way, and later times the other on a sagittal front-back axis. What we would never say in any known spoken language is, oh, that happened way left in the past, or that's going to happen far right in the future. We just don't use the left-right axis for talking about time. And I was pretty well convinced that we didn't use it for thinking about time either, and set out to prove this with an experiment looking at people's spontaneous hand gestures as they told stories about the past or the future. I'm going to share with you one video from one of these experiments where we gave participants, we gave them the opportunity. We pretty much forced them, at least paid them, to tell these silly stories that happened to have the temporal arrows stretching into the past or into the future, giving them opportunities to talk and think and gesture about the past or future. They didn't know their gestures were of interest, but just about everybody. We gesture all the time, whether we know it or not. Now I gesture in the Zoom window. I hope sometimes it's useful and not just distracting. Let's watch as this subject, this volunteer, tells a scintillating story about the history of farming. Let me know if you can't hear it. Okay, take it away.
Okay, so I'm writing a report about how farming methods have changed over the course of the 20th century. The farming methods used by modern farmers are a lot different than the farming methods used at the earlier in the century, which was much more primitive. Like today, they use diesel-powered tractors to plow the fields, whereas only like half a century ago, they were using horse-drawn plows. And then a generation before that, they had to do everything by hand. So I wonder how life was different than for the farmers at the beginning of the 20th century compared to modern farmers.
Yeah, scintillating stories. Students love the stories. Okay, so that's a really dumb story, right? But what the point is, did you see how he was using his hands to gesture spontaneously about time? Did you see all those sagittal front-back gestures about the future is ahead and back in the past? No, I didn't either. He used a left-right axis for gesturing about time. Now, it's not like he was going to smack his partner if he used his a front-back axis, right? They're far apart. He could have used 3 dimensions in space, and he chose to use the left-right axis. And it's not just this guy. If we look at all of the data, we see, whoops, we don't need to hear that again. If we look at all of the data, we see that there's a very strong pattern where people are, not just this guy, but in general, our subjects are systematically gesturing leftward for earlier times and systematically gesturing rightward for later times. If you look on the sagittal axis, you find nothing. There was no systematic pattern whatsoever. And this is a result that we and now others have replicated many times. Well, what's going on here? Why are we not gesturing about time the way that we talk about it and the way that we walk through the world? Well, here's a possibility. Remember the story that I told you about walking, spatializing time on the sagittal axis? Well, that's a natural experience, interacting with the natural world. Other experiences cause us to spatialize time on the lateral left-right axis for very similar reasons. So here, if you're reading a calendar, right, of course, we're going from left to right, where earlier times are on the left and later times are on the right of each row here. But you don't have to be using a cultural convention or cultural practice that is about time. You can simply be reading. Reading spatializes time on the lateral left-right axis. Every line of text that we read, we start on the left at an earlier moment and move through time and space, gradually ending up on the right at a later moment. So every line on each page, left is earlier, right is later, left is earlier, right is later. Across pages, the left is the earlier page, the right is the later page. You flip and repeat. So this cultural experience is giving us a correlation between progress through space and progress through time on the lateral axis. I don't know about you, but I spend so much of my time reading and writing, and sadly, much more time than I spend walking. No wonder this lateral correlation between space and time is what's shaping people's mental representations of time by default, and not the sagittal one anymore. Why do we talk about time sagittally? Well, presumably because these conventions in languages like English and Spanish were established before mass literacy, and certainly before we had keyboards in our pocket and at our fingertips at all times. So let's check into this. Is this true that reading establishes a correlation between space and time that shapes how we conceptualize time? How can we find out? Well, a postdoc, Roberto Bottini, and I a few years ago did a series of studies where we made people judge temporal phrases like a year earlier or a month later, phrases that referred to either the past or the future. And their job was to hit one button if a phrase referred to the past and another button if the phrase referred to the future, either the left button or the right button. And midway through the experiment, we flipped the buttons. Now, if past was left when you started, now past was right and future is left. And then we compare how long it takes people to correctly judge each one of these phrases as a function of whether the left button is corresponding to earlier times or the right button is corresponding to earlier times. And what we see here is something that's now been replicated many, many times, that people are, on average, faster to hit the left button when they're judging phrases about the past, and faster to hit the right button when they're judging phrases about the future. Okay, so that pattern is consistent with the left to right mental timeline, like we saw our guy in the farming story expressing, right? He said things like way back in the past and gestured left, and said and a generation earlier than that and gestured farther to the left, right? That's perfectly consistent with this button press result that we see here. What happens if we expose a different group of subjects to the exact same phrases, the same language, the same task, but the phrases are presented in mirror reversed text? So now, instead of every line training you that left is earlier and right is later, you have to move on each line that you see, move your eyes or at least your attention, starting here on the right at an earlier moment, ending up over here at the left at a later moment, right? After about 5 minutes of exposure to this mirror reversed writing, we find that people's mental timelines are completely flipped. Now they're faster to press the right button for phrases about the past and the left button for phrases about the future. This exposure, very brief exposure to a new writing system has reversed the flow of time in their minds, demonstrating that such tiny changes in the context can have dramatic and measurable cause dramatic and measurable differences in how we're thinking. Excuse me. It's getting a little late, so I want to jump ahead. There's another set of stories. You know what? Let's just do it quickly. Let me tell you another story about time and how our cultural and immediate context can shape it in ways that I certainly never imagined a few years ago. So building on these findings about the left-right mental timeline and how it reverses across cultures, my dear colleague Julio Santiago and I, Julio is at the University of Granada in Spain, followed up on this with another gesture experiment where we had Spaniards and Moroccans, Arabic speakers, tell the same stories. And what we found is that the Spaniards gestured rightward, much like the English speakers, rightward for the future and leftward for the past. The Moroccans did exactly the opposite, right? They read a language that is written from right to left. This was fully expected. It was no surprise here. But for comparison, we analyzed the front-back axis and didn't expect there to be anything interesting there. In fact, what I expected was that that everyone would look just like the English speakers had, and indeed, the Spaniards showed no systematic use of front-back for past and future at all. So this line is 50%. That means you're at chance gesturing either forward for the past or forward for the future. Nothing to see there. They were using a lateral mental timeline that they expressed in their gestures, not a front-back mental timeline. But the Moroccans look really different, right? They are showing a very, very strong pattern. They're putting, they are spatializing time in their gestures on the sagittal front-back axis, as well as the lateral, but it's really, really strong on the sagittal axis. This p-value shows that this is super, super significant statistically. But what does it mean? Does anyone notice anything funny about this graph? See here, black refers to putting the past in front of you. So whereas the Spaniards didn't care where they put the past or future on the front-back axis, the Moroccans were putting the past in front of them and the future behind them almost 100% of the time. Now, it doesn't matter how statistically significant this is. This made no sense to us. There is no theory that predicted this. And so before you interpret a completely crazy backwards finding, first you check your data, and then you see if you can replicate this before you even start worrying about trying to explain it. So that's what we did. We wanted to see, can we replicate this past and front pattern using a complementary method? Why did we need to see if it replicated first? Well, because we didn't have any explanation for this. It certainly wasn't about the way Arabic speakers talk about time. Yes, they write right to left, but that shouldn't impact their front-back mapping of time. And their linguistic metaphors about the past and the future are very much like the metaphors in Spanish and in English. They say things about the future is ahead and the past is behind, but that's not how they were gesturing at all. It also doesn't seem to be explained by the way they walk. So far as our Moroccan informants told us, Moroccans don't tend to walk backwards. So it's not about how they walk. It's not about how they talk, right? Let's see if it's even true. So to replicate this backwards crazy finding, we used a complementary method. We gave people this silly diagram task. They were told that this cartoon character, who's either Juan or Mohammed, is going to visit a friend who likes animals tomorrow. But yesterday he visited a friend who likes plants, and you have to indicate which of these two boxes you should put the tomorrow event, the visiting the animal friend, into, and which box you put the yesterday event in. When did Juan or Mohammed visit his friend who liked plants? And the data that we got from the Spaniards were perfectly in line with our expectations. This diagram is showing where did people put the past. 88% of the time, the Spaniards put the past behind Juan's head, right? The past is behind Juan. The Moroccans, 85% of the time, put the past in front of Mohammed. Well, that's really funny. That's just like these backwards gestures. And what is going on here? It's not about how they walk. It's not about how they talk. We need to posit another hypothesis here. And so we started thinking about what is different with respect to time between Moroccan culture and US or Western European culture. So here's a difference. Imagine that the majority of the men who you know are all named after the same ancient prophet. Imagine that you and almost everyone around you prostrates themselves 5 times a day, dropping to the ground to enact the same ancient rituals and prayers, right? That happens in the Moroccan city where we were testing people. This is a culture that takes the past very seriously, that focuses their attention on the past. So is it possible that this is what's going on? So this sounds sort of like a parody of metaphor theory, but here's the idea. Maybe you place the past in front of you in your mental model of time if the past is what you tend to focus your attention on. How does this work? We call this the temporal focus hypothesis. So to spell this out, people conceptualize events in time as if they were objects in space. Some people and some cultures tend to focus their attention more either on the past or on the future. Maybe people place in front of them in their mental model whichever pole of the temporal continuum they tend to focus on. Why? Well, suppose that these events in time really were objects in space, and you wanted to focus your attention on an object in space. Where would you put it? Well, you wouldn't put it behind your head, you'd put it out here in front of your face. So what you want to focus your attention on, you put in front of your face, right? So that's the idea. Maybe the Moroccans are putting the past in front of them because they focus so much of their attention on the past. Okay, if that's true, then we should be able to quantify people's tendencies to think about the past or the future and find a real difference between, say, Spaniards and Moroccans. So we did this with a silly questionnaire. We asked people, how strongly do you agree with statements like traditions are important for me, that focus you on the past, or technological advances are important for society, things that are about the future. And as expected, we found that the Spaniards were far more future-focused compared to the Moroccans, who were relatively past focused. Okay, this confirms the anecdotes from our collaborators and from ethnographic data. And it gives us a potential explanation for this cross-cultural difference in how people are thinking about time. How do you test it? Well, if it's true that focusing your attention more on one pole of the time continuum or another is causing people to spatialize time one way or the other, then we should be able to find this difference that we observed across cultures within the same culture if we find subgroups that have different tendencies to focus on the past versus future. What subgroups might we find? Well, we know from independent research that younger people are more focused on the future, older people are relatively focused on the past, right? Once you pass what memory theorists call the reminiscence bump, where the bulk of your life's memories get formed sometime in early adulthood, you spend a lot of time looking back on that. So let's find out whether Spaniards differ in their in how they spatialize time as a function of their temporal focus that varies not according to their nationality or their language or anything like that, but just according to their age. Indeed, we find that young Spaniards put the future in front of them the great majority of the time. Older Spaniards are actually more likely to put the past in front of them, right? It's not as strong as the Moroccan pattern, but just being an older person in Spain gets you about halfway to Morocco. So the last thing that we need to do, I'm skipping a replication of these findings, which of course we did because all of this seems so crazy, we couldn't believe that it was happening. The last step, once you've posited a new hypothesis and found some data that shows that across cultures, across groups, there's a correlation between temporal focus and how you spatialize time, we need a different kind of experiment. We need to test whether temporal focus is really playing a causal role in making people think about time one way or the other. How do you do that? Well, you need to take people from the same group and the same subgroup and randomly assign them to have different experiences. So this was really easy to do. We just made people write for about 5 minutes about their past or their future. So you were randomly assigned to get a writing exercise and answer questions like, did you travel anywhere last year? Where'd you go? Or are you planning to travel anywhere next year? Where do you think you'll go, right? And after spending a few minutes writing about your past or your future, focusing your attention on the past or the future, then you get the Juan goes to visit his friend's task. You do our silly diagram task. And if you have been induced in the laboratory to think about your future, you're even more likely than you would be otherwise to put the future in front of you. If you've been induced for 5 minutes to think about your past, then you're about equally likely to put the past in front of you as to put the future in front of you. So again, just thinking about your past for 5 minutes gets you about halfway to Morocco. And this is true even though you haven't changed the way you walk through the world, you haven't changed the way you talk, the linguistic metaphors that you use. You've just changed where you're focusing your attention in the moment. Now, since we did this work about 6 years ago, we've been very fortunate to have wonderful collaborators and in some cases, wonderful colleagues who wanted to challenge this because they didn't believe that this was really, could possibly be what was going on. And we now have 47 independent samples across many, many different cultures and subcultures across many continents, showing that you can measure people's temporal focus with one of these silly questionnaires and predict very, very reliably whether they are likely to put the past in front of them or the future in front of them. Now, all of these, I know you can't read these, but these are many, many different countries, people who speak different languages, have different religions, etc. What determines, what predicts how they're going to think about time and whether the future is ahead or the past is ahead is not about how they walk. It's not about how they talk. These things are incredibly stable and don't predict the way people are thinking. What predicts the way people are thinking about time is where they're focusing their attention, either habitually or many of these data points are about transient manipulations or or passing circumstances. So one of these pairs is pairs of dots, is comparing Chinese people on Tomb Sweeping Day, which is a holiday about the past, versus Chinese New Year, which is a holiday about the future. Another pair of dots compares architecture and history majors at a college to computer science and engineering students at the same college, right? About building, about technology and building things for the future or studying the past. Visitors to a Bronze Age museum, a history museum, versus visitors to a modern art museum. Pregnant women, right? We talk about pregnant as being expecting in English, right? It's a very much future-focused time versus non-pregnant control women. All you have to do is find circumstances that cause you either conditionally or habitually to focus your attention on either the past or the future. And that's what determines whether the future is ahead of you or behind you in your mental model of time. So let me wrap this up. Time in the world is basically the same for everyone. Time in the mind depends radically on our experiential context, our culture, our life stage, and our immediate experience. Saying things like that's way back in time may actually mean left in time, or right in time, or up or down in time, or even forward in time, depending upon the context that you're in. You use the same words, the same expressions to index something different in your mental model. 5 minutes of reading backwards text or of shifting your usual focus of attention to a different pole of the time continuum can reverse the way time flows in our minds, in spite of a very stable lifetime of experience with the future being ahead of us in our walking and in our talking. So this is an example of how variable our thinking is and on how many different timescales it varies. As an illustration, that the mind is being constructed continually on the basis of our interactions with the physical and the social context. When the context changes, our thinking may change accordingly. So what this means is a couple of things. One is that the stability of the mind is in part an illusion. We just don't notice that it's not stable because we're really bad at noticing changes, even changes in front of our face, and certainly changes that only happen fleeting in the privacy of our heads. In part, the stability of the mind is an illusion. In part, it's not an illusion, but it is emergent. The stability of the mind emerges. It is not the stability of the mind that we enjoy, may not be an inherent part of our minds. Rather, that stability is borrowed from stable aspects of the context. How do we know? We know that because if we observe that the context of is stable, then our minds are stable also. But if we change the context, we change our minds with surprising rapidity. So to wrap up, I want to return to this notion that we started with, that the scientific constructs that we use are themselves context dependent. So linguist Ray Jackendoff once noted that asking a psychologist or a philosopher or a linguist what a concept is much like asking a physicist what mass is. An answer can't be given in isolation, right? The answer has to be given in context. So to build on Ray's suggestion, I assume that no physicist working today believes that Newtonian mechanics is an adequate description of the physical world, right? It's wrong, and we think that relativistic physics is a lot less wrong. But we still rely on Newtonian mechanics to solve a lot of practical problems. If you want to know, for example, if you should go on a diet, you're going to use a Newtonian conception of mass, right? However, if you want to understand the workings of the universe to the best of our human abilities, you're going to use a relativistic theory of mass, which is to say, happily for our present discussion, a theory of mass in context. Likewise, there are situations where invoking stable concepts or core meanings of words is going to serve us well. If your kid asks, what does the word aviary mean? You're probably not going to respond to your child, oh, well, that's an ill-posed question. Word meaning is always constructed ad hoc, right? I'm not denying that people learn the conventional denotations of words and that we should tell our kids about them. I'm just saying that we can't confuse those conventional denotations with what words actually mean when people use them. Rather, the fact that words have these memorized conventional denotations helps to make them powerful cues that guide the ad hoc construction of meaning. So as normal people, we can accept that words have meanings, right, and have definitions, great. As cognitive scientists who want to understand the workings of the human mind to the best of our abilities, we need to proceed from the assumption that all concepts and categories and word meanings are constructed ad hoc, and we need to build theories of meaning in context. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Professor Casasanto, I'm very sure that if everybody were able to applaud, we would all be standing up applauding this wonderful presentation, really. We have quite a number of questions, and we have three distinguished professors amongst our public. Mark Turner, you know, co-author with Gilles Fauconnier, who recently and sadly passed away. Professor Randall Paula is in the public, and he made a couple of comments. And my thesis advisor, Ricardo Maldonado, was here. Let me see if he's still, yeah, he's still around. He might wish to say something in a few minutes. And the first question that we have comes from Mark Turner. I'm going to copy paste it to the chat so it's easier to show it to you. Just a second. And I'm going to read it. And if you would like to check it out in the chat too, it says, what is your assessment of the previous tradition of dynamical cognition, continuity of mind? For example, Michael Spivey. If Mark Turner wishes to turn on his microphone to add any other details, that would be, I think, quite appreciated. So I'll leave it.
Hi, Daniel. Thanks for the great talk. This is Mark Turner. As you know, I'm a sympathizer. I wonder what you think of the tradition of dynamical cognition, in particular, all the work on continuity of mind by Michael Spivey.
I love Michael Spivey's work, and continuity of mind is something that I put on my my lab's must-read list, and I think that Spivey's work is a tremendous step in the right direction. I also think that Spivey's work, of course, is joining a group effort by others like the late great Jeff Ellman, and that we have so far to go from our traditional notions of meaning that even great thinkers like Ellman, who took us miles, didn't take us as far as we need to go. And I shared that question, that quotation from Ellman. That's from his alternative view of the mental lexicon, where he was specifying, right, because he's a very clear thinker and writer, was specifying that he believes lexemes to correspond to meanings that exist within a bounded region of state space. And I think that is a heck of a lot. All we can do as scientists, I believe, I'm sure, I suspect we're on the same page about this. As scientists, we can barely even hope to be right. All we can hope is to be incrementally less wrong than we have been. And I think that Ellman moved us not just incrementally a great distance toward being less wrong, but that we need to go farther, and we need to abandon the notion that meaning exists in some bounded region of semantic space.
Thanks for the eloquent answer, characteristically eloquent, and thanks for the talk.
Thank you, Mark. I'm so happy you're here. It's nice to hear from you.
We have a couple of comments from Professor Randy Lapola. So I'm going to post them or copy paste them in the chat, and I'm going to read them. The first comment is, Chinese was mainly written top to bottom in columns, and one of the key metaphors used to talk about time is that the past is up and the future is down. The second comment is, Hume argued that the way we understand time is through change, which is relative to the observer. So time is not an absolute, as Newton had said, but relative. This gave Einstein the clue for his theory of relativity.
Absolutely, yes. All great ideas have parents, and that's a very nice lineage to point out. And I agree with that characterization of how time works in our and how we conceptualize it. Excuse me. The first question was actually a question. Would you mind repeating, Professor, what the first question was? Oh, about Chinese. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry to interrupt. I got it now. Yes. Chinese actually has 3 writing systems, as you probably know better than I do. I'm not a Chinese speaker or reader, but a colleague of mine who is, and who works on cross-cultural differences in temporal cognition, has a wonderful photo that he uses in talks, showing the side of a Chinese bus from a few years ago with advertisements written in all 3 of these scripts, left to right, right to left, and top to bottom. And so there are in the scripts, and also in there are in the scripts 3 different directions for time. In linguistic metaphors, there are at least 3. There's top to bottom, there's front to back, and there's back to front. And I believe that our linguistic metaphors are an incomplete reflection of the non-linguistic mental metaphors that we have, and that we have many more of these, a larger family of these mental metaphors that then is likely to get encoded in language, and then we are likely to use habitually. But this family, there's this superordinate family of mappings that we have in our head that are based on the variety of experiences that we have with the natural world. In the natural world, we observe a correlation between progress through space and progress through time, presumably omnidirectionally, right? Probably more from top to bottom because of gravity, probably more horizontally in all directions because of the way we travel on the Earth, but in principle, omnidirectionally. So I think that the natural world provides us with the sort of raw correlations and experience to think about time in any of these ways. And that's the existence of this family of mappings that are observable and and learnable from the natural world, I believe, is the reason why we're able to switch mappings so quickly, even if it means going exactly the opposite, switching to a mapping that's exactly the opposite of the one we normally use. So yes, it's very cool, but also in some ways unsurprising that Chinese has 3 space-time mappings in orthography and in language, and maybe more that I don't know about.
Randy, would you like to add something else?
No, thank you very much. That's very good. Yes, what he said is spot on, of course. And I was just responding to somebody's comment because someone was asking about what about Chinese, because they were saying Chinese writes right to left. Well, Chinese did write right to left, but they also wrote left to right. And they also wrote up to down. And so I actually have a paper where I talk about this, how Chinese, you can even read left to right and right to left at the same time. There were signs in Taipei where they would write 3 characters and you had to read it left to right for the first 2 characters and right to left for the second 2 characters. So, I mean, even though there's 3 characters, so the middle character could be read in either direction. So they would play with these directions. And but I was just mentioning to the person who had written something in the chat about this, that it's an interesting thing to me when I read old Chinese text, or any kind of Chinese text about the history, I should say, when they talk about up to the ancient time and down to the present. Well, we say that in English too sometimes. So it's just one of the metaphors that we have is this up down that may correspond to the fact that they mainly did write up down in the Chinese. That was just my point there.
Absolutely. I showed you one graph from one of these change the orthography experiments. What we did in the same series was also to rotate the orthography and expose Westerners to either top to bottom or bottom to top, which is not entirely unfamiliar. If you still, to the extent that we still have books and look at them on our bookshelves, we see spines that make us read this way or this way. And after 5 minutes of exposure to temporal phrases going this way or this way, we can orient your mental timeline either going up or going down, either consistent with the Chinese up-down mental timeline or opposite of it. They're all in there, and we can bring them to the surface surprisingly easily.
Thanks for so many great ideas, Professors Daniel Casasanto and Randy. I'm going to proceed to read some other questions that we have from the public. So here's another question about culture, but I think you already tackled that question quite in length in the lecture. However, I will read it. How is this ad hoc meaning construction altered or varied by culture? So I think you already went on that but if you would like to add anything.
Sure, I gave a couple of examples of how cultural conventions or practices or attitudes can shape the way we think and interpret language, think or interpret language. But the sky is the limit. There are so many aspects of culture and so many aspects of language and thought, and so many possible ways that they can interact. So I'm not sure there's a general answer to how does culture influence the ad hoc construction of thinking, thoughts and word meanings. There are some general mechanisms. One of the ones that we were exploring without talking about it as such tonight is that we have this family of associations in memory and source target associations in memory, and the weight of evidence for one member of a family of competing associations can be transiently raised or lowered by the context, or can be habitually raised or lowered by stable aspects of a culture. I think that's the mechanism that we're seeing at work here, is that if you have a single, in a memory network, if you have a single, let's call it our target node, and multiple source nodes that all map to it, you can transiently strengthen one of those source target mappings, and it does two things. But by exercising that mapping, by repeatedly activating it, you both strengthen the one that you're strengthening, but also as a consequence, in a competitive network, as a consequence, you are weakening the others transiently, which is how we end up not having just a mishmash of competing mappings. These dynamics of competitive associative networks have been explored well in sort of basic memory function, and I believe they're at work in these the competition among these rival mental metaphors for the same target domain.
Well, we still have quite a number of questions. If at some point you need to go, just please hint.
My kids are in bed.
Perfect, great. Yeah, because I know that you have that situation. So
the
here's a
only
question.
thing I regret is that I didn't bring a glass of wine.
So here's a question from Lenin Pavon. How are we supposed to teach or make science knowing that the context of the reader may alter the content we are trying to communicate?
Great question. Let's see. I was looking for it in the chat, but I'm not going to find it. How do we teach science? I guess, how do we teach anything? Well, the good news is that there are many stable aspects of the context, and they provide real emergent stability in lots of ways that matter. My argument is not at all, my argument is in part that stuff is way more variable than we think, but my argument is not that everything is variable all the time. It's that those things that are stable inherit their stability, not those things that are stable in our mental lives may inherit their stability from stability in the world, and that this is in some ways a huge expansion of an idea that one of my Cornell psychology forebears put forth in the field of cognition, of visual cognition. So J.J. Gibson believe that the problem of how we can accomplish vision, how vision works, is made tractable by things that are invariant in the visible world. And I think that the problem of cognition is made tractable by things that are invariant in the context in which we're using our minds.
Thank you, Professor Daniel Casasanto. Another question here. How are we supposed to teach? No, sorry. It means that sort of kind of meanings came from a mismatch between time 1 and time 2 and so on. I don't remember very well which part of the presentation was talking about that, but I hope you understand the question.
Would you mind repeating?
Yeah, let me copy it to the general chat, just a second. If you would like to read it directly, it means that sort kind of meanings came from a mismatch between time 1, time 2, and so on. I kind of remember that.
Yeah, so maybe this is in trying to build intuitions about why is it that it's so hard to intuit that we're constructing meaning ad hoc all the time, is that we just don't notice that the last time we used the word dog, the mental representation, the network of information that we activated was quite different then from the network of information that we just activated transiently a moment ago, the next time we used the word dog. And is there a mismatch between the first time and the second time? Almost certainly. In most cases, it doesn't matter, right? In some cases, it really does matter. I think that this is how lots of jokes work, right? That jokes turn on you creating representation number 1 at time 1, and then creating representation number 2 at time 2, sometimes cued by the exact same word, right? And being amused by the difference between those two representations that you've formed. Sometimes we do become aware of it.
Thank you, Professor. Here's another question from Flora Itzel. What happens with native speakers or readers of other languages who read in language like Arab, which is read from right to left? I think you already covered
Thank you.
That part. Another question, are Chinese that wrote and read from right to left in columns for nearly 3 millennia? I think you already covered that part. Let me go through.
There's if I may respond to the non-native reader or speaker reader, there's an interesting literature that's emerging on the neural and cognitive representations that you form in response to reading the same text in a second language. There are ways in which a second language word or sentence is a less potent cue than a first language version of the translation equivalent. That, for example, when we're given an action verb or an action sentence, we run a simulation of the action named by that verb using our brain's motor system. And that is more true if you're reading about throwing in L1, that you run a motor simulation of throwing in your hand areas, than if you read about throwing in a second language. So the power of the cue depends upon a very long-term aspect of the context in which you're using that set of cues or another.
Thank you, Professor. Next question. How could the ad hoc theory affect the way we conceive emotions?
This is not something I've thought about very much. I think that emotion theorists have been on this train long before most of us cognitive scientists. I think that many people who think about emotion have a much more dynamic conception of the mind than people who think about things like language. And maybe that's because of the ineffability of emotions compared to so many things that we like to label and think about using verbal labels. But I suspect an incomplete and insufficient answer is that I think emotion theorists have been on board with the construction of emotion being ad hoc for a long time, that we need to follow their lead.
Thank you, Professor. I just noticed that Professor Ricardo Maldonado did make a comment. which is we need to incorporate the work of phenomenology. Is there anything you would like to say about that, Professor?
I agree. I agree that phenomenology is both a contribution to this story and a challenge to it. And one of the reasons why it's potentially a challenge is because there are so many findings in the history of phenomenology, and I'm thinking of largely about visual perception, where illusions are impenetrable, where context effects are extremely stable and seem perfectly automatic, there may be, this is that, one question that my students and I talk about a lot is there any part of the system that's not ad hoc? And one place where we puzzle about sometimes is action potentials. So action potentials are the firing of a neuron. The doctrine that has developed over a very long time now is that action potentials are perfectly all or nothing. Either a neuron is firing and it fires maximally, or it's not firing. And I've been trying to query neuroscientist friends to find out whether this doctrine is whether it still holds, whether action potentials are still as absolute as we have long thought them to be. And the reason is that reflex actions, it turns out, are much less automatic and much less absolute than we once thought them to be. So it's possible that even the things that we have long accepted to be fully automatic are a lot more variable than we thought. They're relatively automatic compared to other processes, but they themselves are still context dependent. That may be true with some of the really stable phenomena in phenomenology.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for that quite extensive response. Here we have some other questions. I would like to know the impact of sensory motor information on concept building, because your task heavily depends on such coupling to explain time. Furthermore, couldn't it be possible that your experiments enhance other sensory modalities, that is, feeling-related sensory information, and that gestures could be driven by such information, that is, page changing while reading a book? From Mark Antonio Flores Coronel.
So let me share with you some further a sort of heart-stopping moment that I had a few years ago, and a resolution to this fear about activating different modalities in the course of an experiment. And you can tell me if this even comes close to answering your question. So we talked about the gesture experiment early in the sort of empirical part of the talk, where the subject were very reliably gesturing laterally. And then later, and in fact, it was years later in my experimental life, we ran the mirror reading experiments, right, where we either gave people reversed or rotated orthography, and found that exposure to one kind of orthography or another could radically change the direction that time was flowing in your mind. Well, once we saw those results, I got really concerned that this claim that we had made, that the dominant mental timeline, that these gesture data suggest that the dominant mental timeline in English speakers' minds, at least habitually by default, is the lateral timeline. That it was a finding that was completely created in the lab, and that it was an artifact of how we did the experiment. How we did the experiment was that we had people read brief stories printed on the screen in left to right orthography, and then commit these to memory and then tell them back to their partner as if they were their own life experiences. Well, no one ever, we thought, is this a problem that we're exposing them to writing? We thought, no, of course not. How could a few minutes of exposure to a writing system change the way you conceptualize time? Well, then we found out that it could. So was this gesture result an artifact of this experimental procedure? My student De Fu Yap went back and redid the experiment, comparing subjects who told the exact same stories presented in written text versus presented through headphones, only auditorially. And they never saw any writing from the time they came to the experiment. We read them their consent forms, we read them the instructions, right? And they still use there's no difference in the results. It was not that we transiently lateralized them by exposing them to written stories and instructions. In fact, I think what's happening is that our culture is more than just transiently making the lateral mental timeline the dominant one in our minds. So,
next question from Sofia Barajas. Past is up and future is down in media feed. I guess she means, I'm pretty sure she means that when we are working on a computer or a cell phone, we are scrolling up and down. And that reminds me of something I've heard sometime before about Egyptians doing it that way with scrolls. I think that's what they, or some other cultures. So that's personally, I think, a very interesting thing to discuss.
So when I started doing these experiments, it was the early 21st century. Some of the most recent data that we actually discussed tonight are from 6 years ago. The amount of time and the ubiquity of scrolling through your email. I mean, I think 6 years ago, I'm not sure I read my email on my phone. I'm a little slow. And now, of course, we have these scrolling through time on our ubiquitous devices all the time. I would not be surprised, and maybe someone knows of new work that I'm not aware of. The up-down mental timeline in English speakers has been tested many times, and we have found in gesture and in these button pressy kinds of experiments that, as I mentioned, we can induce you to think about time vertically, but by default, if we don't specially train you, you don't think about time vertically. At least you didn't a few years ago when we did these experiments. I would not be surprised if our ubiquitous scrolling through emails on every device has trained up, has increased the weight of evidence for a vertical mental timeline much more in recent years than we had previously. Now, the only countervailing force is that some applications, some devices might arrange things differently, right? That earlier is at the top or later is at the top. If that's not consistent, then one set of experiences is gonna cancel out the training you get from the other. If it is consistent, I'll bet if we redid these experiments 10 years later, that we would find more automatic activation of a vertical timeline. But that's just than we did a few years ago. That's just a guess.
Thank you, Professor. Next question is from Sofia Barajas, or maybe the past is ahead because you can remember it, and future is behind because you cannot predict it or see it.
Yeah, so that is the explanation that, before we, years before we did this work, Rafael Nunez and collaborators and Yves Switzer reported on the Aymara, who have linguistic metaphors that put the past in front of them, and it seems that they gesture accordingly. And the reason that their Aymara, Nunez and Switzer's Aymara informants gave for this was twofold. One was about evidentials in language, and the other was about this idea that the past is in front of you because you can see it, right? Oh, so yeah, because you can see it. Well, I don't think that. First of all, the evidentials explanation you can sort of rule out just by looking at other evidential languages that don't have this this quote backward past future mapping in language, right? Turkish and Korean and so forth don't have an Aymara like the past is ahead, or that the eyes in the front are the past. So it doesn't seem likely that that's about evidentials. I totally buy their explanation, the Aymara informants intuition, that the reason they put the past ahead in language and in gesture and presumably in thought is because the past is where you can see it. You know, that part is similar to what we're proposing. But remember, we can induce you to either put the past or the future in front of you with a few minutes of training. We have not, through that few minutes of training, or through picking you up when you're at the history museum or the technology museum, we have not changed the visibility of the future, right? You still can post-dict the past, and you can't predict the future. So the kinds of changes that we have observed can modulate whether you put the past in front of you or the future in front of you, have nothing to do with the foreseeability of the future. They do have to do with where you're focusing your attention.
Thank you, Professor. We still have 3 questions, if that is okay for you, with you. So I'll paste it to the chat if you would like to read it as I read it. So this is from Jose Alejandro Rangois Arechavala. Dr. Casasanto, are you familiar with the work of French philosopher Gilbert Simondon, specifically regarding his theory of individuation and the concept of ontogenesis? If so, how does his general notion of individuation compare to ad hoc meaning creation as an instance of individuation?
I am not familiar with Simondon, but I am pasting this into a document right now because it sounds like I need to be. Let's see, I'm going to put this at the bottom of the Word doc that I happen to have open. Thank you so much. I'm going to take that as a recommendation.
Thank you, Professor. Here is another question. I already pasted it on the comments. So hello, from Santiago Villaseñor. Hello, Professor, excellent talk. I'm a psychologist student in the field of cognitive sciences, and I'm very attracted to the topic of linguistic relativity. I even have read some of your articles, and I wanted to ask you, which is the best way to study it? Are there any general tips for approaching to work on this topic?
I would say, if I could offer a general tip, I stumbled upon a very powerful general tip, general procedure by accident, and it shaped my whole scientific life. The reason that I started doing linguistic relativity work was because I was, at the time, a PhD student with Steven Pinker, who is a vehement opponent of linguistic relativity. Still is opposed, and at the time just couldn't even countenance the idea that there was any merit to this proposal. And so I designed my linguistic relativity experiments so as to falsify the linguistic relativity hypothesis. And many people, so this is a sort of counterintuitive aspect of the scientific method as we inherited it from the philosopher Karl Popper, that the way that we make progress in science and the explanation for our crazy backwards null hypothesis testing is that we seek to disconfirm hypotheses rather than to confirm hypotheses. Confirmation happens if you repeatedly try to disconfirm a hypothesis, and it as he says, proves its mettle by not getting disconfirmed. So the only general principle that comes to mind, other than you should think carefully because lots of people will think you're crazy, is that if you are designing experiments, make sure that you are designing them to disconfirm the theory of interest, the hypothesis of interest. I learned that by accident. I learned that by being profoundly wrong and having my data teach me that I was profoundly wrong. And that's actually the function of the Popperian scientific method, to teach you when you're wrong, right? Or disabuse you of things that you thought you knew. And so work that method.
Thank you, Professor. Here's a question from one of our friends in the organizing committee from Mary Kristen Gracia. Is your theory somehow based on Einstein's theory of relativity? Because it considers several variables that are similar, the space-time approach to begin with.
I think that this idea of the comparison that I made at the end, and somewhat tongue-in-cheek but somewhat sincere, was that a modern conception of physical concepts like mass is that they must be understood in context. There's no such thing as mass or speed or many of these physical variables per se. They're only relative. And I think that there's a parallel to be drawn to the constructs that we study, where we want them to be, that we want to be able to locate them and pin them down per se. And actually we can only pin them down in context relative to the circumstances under which we're studying them. So sometimes people will say, are you saying that our conception of time is relativistic? And I suspect that it's not, that our conception of time is clearly context dependent, but the possibility that the human psychology of time is shaped by Einsteinian relativity seems really unlikely to me, because we're talking about folk notions, right? And it's really like very few people actually understand Einsteinian relativity of time, and I'm not sure that I'm among them. And so our psychology probably reflects experiences that we have a little greater access to.
Thank you, Professor. Here is another comment from Rocio Viruega Aranda. It's interesting that in music, we use a lot of these concepts of relativity all the time. I haven't thought like that ever, just after this talk. And that's very interesting, since I think you have some education in music, right?
I have. It's part of my dark past.
Here is another question from Cecile. I'm going to copy paste it. Is the illusion of stability necessary for communication?
This is I'm so happy you asked that question. This is something that many people have gotten hung up on. We have one of the foundational documents in cognitive linguistics is Reddy's conduit metaphor chapter, which I love. And well, I think that analysis accurately describes how we tend to think about transmission of information as information is things traveling through a conduit from one place to the other. And I actually think that this is not a critique of Reddy's analysis. But I think that the fact that we think about communication as transmission of a substance through a conduit really leads us astray, and that in fact it leads to a problem, which is, well, if what I'm sending, if I'm sending my concept of cat to you, right, or my meaning of cat, and you don't share that meaning of cat either habitually or in the moment, then how can we communicate? And I think there are a couple of answers. One is that, well, actually, how can we understand each other? And the glib answer that I actually stand by is, well, actually, we don't. That mutual understanding is accomplished somewhat, but probably not nearly as much as we think. That actually there are much greater gaps in understanding than we're aware of most of the time, for some of the reasons that I was talking about earlier. And the other reason is that, it's just not necessary. What the listener needs to do is to be prompted by the linguistic signal per se, which is the cue that you focus on, and the context in which the social, physical, etc. context in which that cue occurs. They have to be prompted to build a contextually appropriate mental representation. And that contextually appropriate mental representation may be a complement to the representation that the sender formed. The recipient may often need to form a complementary, not a matching representation. And that in fact, if you formed a matching representation, that would constitute a total failure of communication, right? If I say, it's hot in here, right? To take a classic pragmatic example. If I say it's hot in here and I'm looking toward the closed window and you say, yes, he believes it is hot in here. We have not succeeded, right? Even though you have built a mental representation that's very similar to the one that I sent at some level. You need to build a complementary mental representation to what I sent, which is mine was I am hot, and I see a potential solution, and yours is he is hot, and I'm going to enact that solution, right? So I think that actual mutual understanding is probably overestimated, and that matching is overrated. In fact, matching is unlikely and in many cases undesirable.
Thank you, Professor. We still have 3 more questions. They came up just recently. Raul asks, comments and asks, the idea of the diagram of the unpredictability in experience thought it was very interesting. It reminds me the catastrophe theory. Did you take ideas from any theory similar to this?
Yeah, so the diagram of the arrows, the colored arrows going from straight to, I'm frozen. Am I still with you? Am I still with you? My screen froze. Okay. Oh, good. The diagram with the colored arrows that go haywire was actually taken from my own experience of learning the mathematics of nonlinear dynamical systems. I made a brief and not very successful attempt to get involved in heart rate variability and cognition research. There's so much information in the variability between our heartbeats that is linked in ways that we're just starting to unlock to other metabolic events and to cognitive events. And it turned out that I wasn't very good at this research, but I really tried. And in trying to get better at it, I had to learn. I had to learn some nonlinear dynamical math of nonlinear dynamical systems, and there was a period in my life where I would just be graphing nonlinear functions in my head all the time, and just being amazed at this property of sensitive dependence on initial conditions. So that set of maths was an inspiration. I don't know anything about catastrophe theory. It sounds really interesting though. And again, maybe I should take that as a recommendation.
Thank you, Professor. Another question from Laura Santillan. Then, do we ever think in present or about the present? If so, how do we represent it?
Do we ever think about the present? So I don't know. But the person who I would point you to read, and maybe you've already read this and that's why you're asking, is William James from 1908's psychology volumes. His discussion of the specious present. Specious because what we think of as the present isn't really the present. It's actually usually the immediate past. So there's some beautiful thinking and writing about do we ever think about the present in William James. If you haven't read James's Psychology, which is his introduction to the field for non-specialists, I can't recommend it strongly enough. I feel like much of my research life is just trying to catch up with what James understood intuitively 112 years ago.
Thank you, Professor. Another question here from Alejandra Siria Fernandez Varela. If there is still time for one more question, what do you think about considering concepts as a special type of affordances as being possibilities of meanings?
Yeah, so I think that the idea of affordances is something that I was just about invoking earlier. That there are these stable aspects of the environment, and our response to them is one of the things that makes the problem of cognition tractable. So the theory of affordances, I think, is really important, and I agree completely that whereas affordances were proposed as part of the solution to how do we interact with the world perceptually and motorically, I believe that they are equally applicable to problems of cognition and meaning.
Thank you, Professor. I think this is probably the last comment question. This is from Citlali Martinez. The Aztec culture used to represent the past is in front because you need to learn from it. And when scrolling, I think most often we want to find things that are more or less recent. So the best option is that the most recent items comes first. And I think she didn't complete her last idea. There was a clear reason why they did. But I already pasted her comments in the chat, so you can.
I didn't know this about Aztec time. How interesting.
Yeah.
Right. You put, if you need to learn something from something, you put it where you can examine it, and that's in front of you. So maybe the Aztecs were metaphor theorists.
Thank you, Professor. Oh, and we have one question from the YouTube transmission. It says, hello, sir. Is syntax really science? Is there any recent evidence in support of it?
I'm not quite sure how to answer that. Is syntax real? I can give a very quick answer to that. I think syntax is among the scientific constructs that I was mentioning at the beginning. That syntax is something that humans made up. There is something out in the world that we are seeking to index when we talk about syntax. And there is real structure in the world that we are trying to carve up and categorize and label by calling something syntax, by calling something a pronoun, by calling something a concept, right? But my belief is that none of these are natural kinds, and in fact there may not be any natural kinds, and our job may not be what the forebears of modern science thought the scientist's job was, which is to understand nature. Chomsky's been arguing for years that actually we now understand that the scientist's job is to build the most useful models of nature possible. And we make up these constructs to help us build models that are useful to us humans. And they can be useful irrespective of how true they are to some objective natural order. So syntax is made up, but so is everything else.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. Well, it's already 9:05 over here. I guess it's 10:05 p.m. Where you live, and we wouldn't like to abuse your resting time. So I think we will close it right there if you agree, Professor Daniel Casasanto. We are so happy to have hosted you. It was an impressive lecture. We have learned so much. I have no words to express all my gratitude and the gratitude that very surely everyone else is feeling right now. So one of my colleagues, teacher Sergio Reyes, is going to say a few last words to close this presentation. So please, teacher Sergio.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for such an enjoyable evening. I really appreciate your questions.
Thank you, Professor. Teacher Sergio Reyes, Crespo.
Yes, okay. On behalf of all the teachers from Mexico City and other parts of the world that are following these conferences about language in general. Today, I was thinking while you were talking about your theories, and
Teacher Sergio?
I'm going to continue thinking about that. But how I'm an English teacher, how am I going to put this into practice? These theories that are very interesting in the way that we see and think about language. So thank you very much, Dr. Casasanto, and we hope this is not the first time that we are going to have you here. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Professor Daniel Casasanto. I also hope that we can meet again sometime in the future. I know you have a very, very tight agenda. We were planning this since about 5 or 6 months ago, and we finally made it here. So I'm really, really grateful for all your support and the time that you have spent with us. So that's all for today. We'll send everyone the YouTube link for so that you can watch everything once again, and the link for the certificates of attendance is already in the chat. By the way, you will receive more comments there, which we will send you later on to your email, Professor Daniel Casasanto.
Thank you. Thank you all, and until we meet again.
Until we meet again. Thank you so much, Professor, and thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you so much, Professor Casasanto.
If anybody else wants to say goodbye. Si el público quiere decir algo más para despedirse.
Goodbye. Thanks for everything.
Thanks for the brilliant lecture, Professor. It was, I think I will keep thinking about this for a long time now.
You're very kind. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Professor Casasanto, for this emotion lecture. I really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you.
And with that, I'll close the meeting. See you later, and have a very nice.
Thank you there.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you there. Have a good night. Bye-bye.